welcome to the latest episode in my Nazi series podcast, Legacy and Lessons. Guten Tag, Michael.
How appropriate to start with Guten Tag. Yes, I'm broadcasting from Nuremberg, Germany today, where I'm teaching a course in the Holocaust and the law here and for American and German law students. So, Guten Tag, mein Freund. Wie geht es dir?
So we're in basically the same time zone for the first time. We're only an hour ahead now. So we're both in late afternoon. So good late afternoon for you, however you say that in German. I actually did do German for a year. It was probably more than a year, but like in high school, and I was quite poorly behaved in my German classes. So I didn't retain much. My German vocabulary now consists of euphemisms that the Nazis used and various Nazi language. So apart from that, my conversational German is not very good unless I'm talking about the final solution, which is kind of useful now. So we've come to the end of our mini-series on the Operation Reinhard death camp trials, killing center trials, and we're going to cover the Treblinka trials today. So we started with the Einsatzkommando trial, and then we moved on. Just for context, we thought we needed to cover that. Then we did the Auschwitz Frankfurt trial, and we've done Belzec, Sobibor, and now Treblinka. So it's been, I think it's fair to say, an unending conveyor belt of horror and suffering. Would you say, Michael?
Yes, indeed. And of course, it will continue with Treblinka, which is, what can you say? It beggars description. Yeah, and the sheer intensity of the suffering and the cruelty and the genocidal bloodlust of the perpetrators. So, add to the list.
I was thinking the other day, I was doing a presentation on Rudolf Höss, and I was talking about when Rudolf Höss actually he visited Treblinka at one point. I'm not sure if you knew that. He wrote about it in that book that he wrote whilst he was on death row. And he was observing the killing methods of Globocnik and comparing and contrasting. Mainly it was the choice of Zyklon B or exhaust to murder victims. And he was still quite braggadocious in this autobiography that he penned, saying that his victims had less knowledge of what was about to happen to them, that his gas chambers could hold more people, and he felt that Zyklon B was more effective. And I was thinking about victim numbers of Operation Reinhard, and I think it's quite appropriate to mention now they've come to the end of the three major death camps that were involved in this operation. So we're talking about 1.7 million people in about 18 months. And that is, in Holocaust education, as you'll know, we do like to move away from the numbers because it's difficult to humanize numbers, and for students to, if I say 6 million to somebody, there's no real humanity in that, and it's kind of just an abstract term. They don't really get any real understanding, but numbers obviously are important for us to understand the scale and the scope. 1.7 million people in 18 months. So that is, and this is simple maths, but this just, I think, even emphasizes it even more, 100,000 victims a month for 18 consecutive months, just Operation Reinhard. And I just thought that to myself, and I just thought that really is mind-blowing. 100,000 people in 1 month. Like, even if it was just that, a 1 month operation, 100,000 people died, but that was repeated 18 times in a row. It's just such a staggering death count. And Operation Reinhard was wrapped up because they'd more or less achieved their objectives, right? By the end of Operation Reinhard.
Yes, that's pretty much the case. They have not succeeded in murdering all of the Jews of the general government, which was the original purpose, but they certainly murdered most of them. And of course, the war began to shift against them, and the camps were, for various reasons, closed. There were a couple of uprisings, one at Sobibor and one at Treblinka, that then formally ended both of those camps. As we know, there were then efforts to try to erase any signs of the camps through Sonderkommando 1005, which came in at the Pau Global, try to dynamite the buildings and destroy the material traces of the camps. But yeah, they were largely successful in killing a great many of the Jews of the general government, and of course Jews from other parts of Africa and Europe as well. Yeah, I like your point, Johnny, about the numbers. I actually do talk numbers in my classes. I can't get away from the numbers. I think it's important to try to communicate the scale of what we're talking about. When you just said 100,000 per month during the time of Operation Reinhard, I think that is a number that you can kind of hang on to a little bit. It just goes to the essence of a point that Raoul Hilberg, the very famous historian of the Holocaust, I think of him as the founder of Holocaust studies, the discipline of Holocaust studies, in his book, The Destruction of the European Jews. I remember him talking at a class I took with him at the Holocaust Museum back in the 90s. And he was talking about Hannah Arendt's banality thesis, the idea that the essence of the Nazi criminal was thoughtlessness, and she thought of Eichmann in particular as being a banal sort of character who didn't really think deeply into the nature of what he was doing. And this is a thesis she advanced in her book on in Jerusalem. I just remember Frau Hilberg sort of taking issue with that interpretation. And he talked about the numbers again, much as you did just a moment ago, and said that the numbers are so stupendously colossal that it's hard for the human mind to wrap itself around, right? And for him, Adolf Eichmann, who was of course in charge of transportation and sending Jews from general government and other parts of occupied Europe to the Operation Reinhard camps. This is an undertaking unlike any other in history, and demonstrated anything but banality in Hilberg's eyes. He thought it indicated an extraordinary capacity for organization and the ability to adhere to construct and to adhere to timetables and to mobilize the resources of the state to put people on trains and send them to their demise in the Operation Reinhard camps. So
yeah. We didn't do the Eichmann trial for various reasons. That it's just been done so many times before, and where I thought one of the points of these podcasts we were doing was trying to cover lesser known trials, but also I don't think that I could do the Eichmann trial in just one podcast either. There's so much in there, especially because you mentioned Hannah Arendt would have to go into her thesis and some of the issues with her thesis, and the one of them is that she wasn't there for much of the trial actually, but she also seems like she was really quite taken by Eichmann's defense, because Eichmann, it appears to me that he doesn't want to die, and I see this again and again in the perpetrators, and it's understandable. We humans have a penchant for staying alive. And he really wanted to come across as this mindless bureaucrat, but in several other interviews, his viciousness, his anti-Semitism comes through, but she didn't know about that.
Yeah.
And I think, point well taken about Hilberg. Whatever I do in Holocaust education or Holocaust studies, and I'm sure you'd agree, we're in a sense standing on Hilberg's shoulders.
Very much.
And this,
that's how I think of us too. I really do. I think other people within the field who were influenced by Ralph Hilberg and worked with him to some extent feel the same way.
And you are a colleague of Browning as well. You know him. You've spoken to him. You've met him before.
I have, yeah, several times, and marvelous fellow, by the way. Obviously, a great historian, especially a great historian of the Holocaust and the Final Solution in particular. His book is still Ordinary Men. I think is still one of the very best books on the Holocaust. But it's interesting. I think I don't want to speak obviously with Christopher Browning, but just in conversations I've had with him and in reading his books and so forth, the impression I have is that he considers himself to be standing on the shoulders of Paul Hilberg along with everybody else.
Very much so. Yeah, he explicitly says that. Actually, the genesis of him entering the field, apparently he was ill once.
Yes, that's
and
right.
He had Destruction of the Euro. It's a hefty read. I advise any of our listeners to go and read it, but it's timeless because he's the amount of people criticize the fact that it's solely reliant basically on perpetrator documents, and the field's moved on a bit since then. But it's an incredible work of history.
As if all the contemporary critics of the older view had mastered perpetrator testimony. Well, a lot of them don't even read German, let alone having mastered all the intricacies of perpetrator testimony. I mean, no, it's to me it's at the crux, and for anybody who deals with this from a legal standpoint, you can't get around it. I mean, perpetrator testimony is of the essence, because without the perpetrators, you don't have a crime. You don't have post-war trials. You don't have people standing in the dock. You don't have people going to prison, or in some cases going to the gallows for what they did.
And Browning said about Arendt's thesis, famously, his quote is, "Right theory, wrong man," about Eichmann, about the banality of the. And it also makes me think, like, what an incredible few years, like the beginning of the 60s was, because you've got the destruction of the European Jewry comes out, and you've got essentially simultaneously the Eichmann trial. I think they're both 61. And then Arendt's reporting on the Eichmann trial and the banality of evil comes out. First of all, it's published in the New Yorker, and then I think in 63 she publishes it as Eichmann in Jerusalem, as we know. But then you've also got the Milgram experiments as well in the mix as well at the beginning of the 60s. So these three people are commenting on each other's work. And
of course, the Milgram experiments seem to have been, to a certain extent, actuated, I think, by the Eichmann trial.
Right.
Go back and take a look at his, what was the title of his book? Obedience? Something.
Yeah, Obedience to Authority.
Yeah, he had the book and then he had the movie, or the documentary film too.
Yeah.
And he explicitly says in his, I think it's in his book, that he was inspired to undertake these experiments I think he said based on the Eichmann trial, but it might have been Nazi criminality, even at a broader sort of scale.
Yeah, I think he had a person. I think he's a Hungarian Jew as well, so he had, like, it was personal for him as well. But yeah, that's interesting to know that the Eichmann trial may have influenced him. Yeah, I'd love to talk to you about the Milgram experiments. They're fascinating. People know the control. I think it's control 4 or something, the one that we all know. But he did many different variations on that test. Some of them very, very unethical, and that's why we're still talking about them, because you just can't do that stuff these days.
No,
I think in one of his controls he had family members doing it. So I think they were either doing it to their own family members, or they thought that their family was sat on the other side, or they had their family in there somewhere. And then there's all sorts of ethical considerations about. He didn't tell them, obviously, what was really going on. And he said, yeah, I told them on the way out. And then there's people coming out and saying, listen, for years, I thought that I'd killed a guy. And I was shameful. Like, I was wrapped with shame because I thought I'd killed some guy. So.
Really extraordinary times, the 1960s. Of course, 60s were also the time of the upheavals in 68, which were really significant in Germany, where the younger generation suddenly turns around and confronts the older generation, which had been trying to put the past to bed, to move on. And the younger generation now begins to confront the older generation with the crimes of the Nazis and the Holocaust in particular. So it was, of course, this is the rise to the Red Army faction and in Germany, West Germany in particular, which was again propelled to a large extent, and some of the Red Army terrorists even said as much. A good one, Insolence in particular, said that what they were striking at was the Auschwitz generation. To actually use that term to describe what they saw themselves as fighting against, the Auschwitz generation. So the 60s were a really seminal period of time for the history of what we're talking about.
Yeah, and we're living through a really, really seminal time now in Holocaust education. I work with survivors quite often now, and my project uses technology as well to try and capture Holocaust testimony and teach students about. And one of the reasons for that is we can see that the Holocaust is slipping out of living memory, and it will be in our lifetimes. In the next 10 years, it will move. It will transition from something which is in the hearts and the minds of human beings to something that we have to keep alive and keep making sure that the messages are learned and not lost. So it's a very, very seminal time, would you say, now for Holocaust education?
But undoubtedly, and getting back just for a moment to this notion of perpetrator testimony and how the field is shifting more and more in the direction of victims. Well, I think the courtroom documents are essential in both regards. Because, as you know, the courtroom documents record literally millions of pages of testimonies by Holocaust survivors. And these testimonies were taken in some cases, just think of it, late 1950s, early 1960s, that's 15 years after the end of the war. So many of these survivors were still relatively young. Some of them were in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, and they were able to offer really cogent, in some cases, lacerating testimony about their experiences, and we certainly see that in the Treblinka trial.
Yeah.
Which is replete with the most harrowing and affecting and poignant testimony. I think of all of the Operation Reinhard trials that I looked at, I think that the Treblinka case affected me the most.
Yeah, I was reading your chapter in preparation for this, and as you know, I've done my own research in the area, and one thing that I was thinking about is when you come across another testimony, it's not like you've read it before. There's an unending amount of these testimonies, this sadistic cruelty, this heinous suffering and pain and death. But each one of these stories, of these incidences that a survivor relays, or a perpetrator indeed, because some of the perpetrators were very frank at the trial.
Surprisingly so. Yeah, some of them surprisingly so.
They all have
things slide sideways against them. I talked about that in my chapter on the Treblinka trial. Because there were some brave efforts early on to try to present a united front, but then it begins to crumble because the eyewitness testimony is so devastating to the perpetrators, and then they begin to peel off and to admit to wrongdoing, in an effort to try to salvage themselves as the case goes forward.
And each of these eyewitness or perpetrator testimony, when they're telling like an individual incident, it's difficult to explain unless you've read, like you have and I have, so many of these, but each one of them is uniquely horrifying. It doesn't feel, it's this same old stuff, like more of the same. Obviously, it's because the victims are, again, new individuals, so it's talking about the horrendous, mind-boggling suffering and death of innocent individuals or an innocent individual, and it's the way the varied ways that people die in Treblinka, you know, as if the gas chambers aren't horrific enough. These arbitrary murders, and I think we should probably start by talking about Kurt Franz, because his name is in lights for this trial. Usually for these trials, like with Belzec, it was Oberhauser who was the main focus. We spoke about with Auschwitz Frankfurt, Mulker had his name in lights. And for Treblinka, it was Kurt Franz and his behaviour. And one of the things we mentioned, the uprising. So there was dozens of people. More people survived the Treblinka uprising than the Sobibor uprising. So we have dozens of people. By the time of the trial, they had 180 witnesses. Lots of these were historians, specialists, and we might even get on to talking about the fact that Konrad Lorenz was even there, which is just
it's fascinating.
Yeah. But look, we have all of these different survivors that are just saying that Kurt Franz was just, pardon my French, just a fucking monster. People say just that Jacob Wiernik said, in my estimate, he personally murdered 1,000 people, among them Jews and Poles. Every day I saw how he murdered people and abused his victims. He was accustomed to setting his dog Barry on them. And another witness said, the court said that Franz revealed a kind of sadism and such contempt toward all Jewish life that can scarcely be envisaged by the human imagination. When I was doing my research, and one of the things I liked about doing my research, probably the wrong word, but I think you get what I mean, is that I was uncovering testimony that was collecting dust in an archive that may well have never been read again if I hadn't gone in there. And these voices, these incidents had been lost to history. But one I found was Simon Siegel. So at the time that he gave his deposition to Kurt Swiderski, the investigating judge for this, he was age 41, professional knitter and a stateless refugee from Poland. And according to Siegel, Franz regularly subjected inmates, including him personally, to physical abuse if their work was unsatisfactory. He boasted that he was a professional boxer and resorted to using his fists to demonstrate his skills. This is something that you've probably heard before about Franz being a boxer and killing people with his fists, but he also used to have mock boxing matches. So he would, if he found in the victims that there was a boxer, he'd challenge them to a boxing match. And on some occasions, he puts a revolver in his boxing glove and shoots the guy dead instead of actually fighting him. And then Siegel goes on and he says that he often beat people to death with his fists for suspecting them of minor theft, like food. Obviously, they're in a completely deprived and desperate situation, so people try to steal food to keep themselves alive, and Franz would kill them for that with his own fists. Once, Franz stopped this prisoner while carrying water to the kitchen, then punched this Jew, and when he was lying on the ground with his boots on his head and in his face, kicked him until he was dead. On another occasion, Siegel remembers that a prisoner from Warsaw who oversaw the lumber depot had written notes in Yiddish on a plate used for barrack construction. After finding these notes, Franz collected them and took this labourer to Stangel's office. Another Jewish prisoner was kept inside the office as a clerk, and he was tasked with translating the notes. Fatally for the prisoner in question, these records pertained to things he had witnessed within the camp. Franz then went into the forest with the manager of the wood store in the direction of the shooting range. The plate with the records was attached like a flag to a stick that the lumberyard manager had to carry. The manager of the lumber store was shot dead on the shooting range after he had to read the notes out loud. And there's just instant. We were talked about Kurt Franz last time, who abused and murdered somebody that had tried to commit suicide. There's an incident of Franz doing that as well. And just this man, Michael, I'm sure even in all the unending horror that you've read in your lifetime, haven't come across many people as horrendous as this.
Is he the worst perpetrator that you've come across in your readings on the Holocaust?
He is for me, yeah, because I spent so much time thinking about him.
Yeah, I mean, typically people think it's interesting how the popular perceptions are. They think of Mengele as being the worst, or maybe Hirsch, Rudolf Hirsch, or Eichmann. No, it's this guy. For me, there's no category of analysis that really fits him. And he enjoyed command authority, so he wasn't just a lower level guy. He was a sub commander, kind of a deputy for a time, and then of course Stangl was out of the camp so often, and Franz would become the commandant of the camp during Stangl's kind of absences. And imagine establishing that tone in a place like Treblinka, a tone that is being set by a psychopathic sadist, a malignant, narcissistic, psychopathic sadist that we rarely encounter anywhere, and yet is in a position of command authority at Treblinka, and sets the tone for everybody else. And there are plenty of other, I don't know if they're psychopaths or not, but they were prolific killers and torturers at the prisoners there. And I'm thinking of August Mita and Heinrich Mattes and a few others who were given life sentences for it. You subtract Kurt Franz from that equation, assuredly Treblinka still kills a lot of people, but I don't think it's, I don't think that the extraordinary surplus of cruelty and sadism and savagery that marks Treblinka, even among its peer death camps, as being, especially horrible. I don't think it achieves that pitch, that caliber of monstrousness.
And
I think the same way, by the way, Johnny. The court said as much in its opinion.
I think Franz is a good example of how you get ahead in the killing center environment, because he, like we've said, he reached command authority. He was a cook by training, which is one of the interesting things about him. He was in T4, I think Grafeneck, Sonnenstein, maybe Bernberg or Brandenburg as well. So like many of them he'd been saying, but he only worked at a cook in these places.
So far as we know, he was a cook. Yeah.
And I think he was ambitious, and he learned how to get ahead in this environment. And it's about a cruel and brutal and cold killing and abuse of the victims. That was a way to garner status and promotions. And so if somebody did get a promotion, then for me it says that you were behaving in a vicious and cruel way towards the prisoners. You had no humanity in you whatsoever, and obviously that is what's needed in order to operate in that environment.
Among the many, many acts of senseless, sadistic cruelty, and you mentioned that the boxing that he would do where he would beat people to death with his fists. So he also did sports shooting. They actually had contests among the guards to see who could kill somebody at 50 yards with their rifle. Just a prisoner who's going about his day, one of the virtues who's just attending to whatever tasks he had to do. And they would snipe the person from a distance, and the one shot closest to the heart, who did the kill shot, would win the wager. It was just sports shooting of the prisoners.
It's incredible that people can become so desensitized to the agony and the suffering of a fellow human, isn't it? Like, but
exalting in bloodlust. I mean,
how does that even happen?
The banality thesis doesn't work here. There's a level of willful malevolence, of evil and just human wickedness, and rejoicing in the suffering of innocent people, men, women, and children. And you
Yeah,
know,
how
the
does that
crimes committed on
happen?
children, the crimes committed on children were routine in the camp.
How does that happen? I think the fact that that behavior in itself reap rewards as well,
Yeah,
because it's quite
he was totally.
performative. Ah, look, I don't care about humans. I'll slaughter them at a whim, and then that's getting you a promotion. You're like, okay, I'll keep doing this, and then maybe, well, obviously, you start to enjoy it. Like really, he obviously really enjoyed it. He comes across like he was completely intoxicated
Yeah,
by having the power at his whims. You know, there's a source that you include in your chapter where there's infants laying in the gas chambers and they're being, they're being finished off, and then Franz is like, "Oh, listen, I'll show you how to do it," and he's the one that goes up and like gets them, and he's just like smashing these babies or baby against the wall of a gas chamber. Like, is there a more heinous murder that you've ever heard of? That there's a baby in a gas chamber and he's getting it by the ankles and swinging it into a wall.
no.
Um,
And this was the order of the day, though. I mean, these were not, as we've seen in our discussions of Sobibor and Belzec and some of the other camps. This is what they did, and nowhere more frequently than at Treblinka. And I think again because of the tone established there by Franz, who exercised that command authority with such an outsized malign presence within the camp, and he was able to give full vent to his sadistic impulses.
and at the like he was my main research that I did whilst I was in Germany is I got the files of Kurt Swiderski's deposition. So this was all the letters that he was sent by witnesses, perpetrators, and victims, and these were like stacked up. And then I only had a certain amount of time, so then I focused on Kurt Franz's prisoner files as well. So the file that was kept on him whilst he was in prison, and he was just a complete bastard for his entire life. He never ever admitted a thing, and at the court as well. And you mentioned this in the chapter. He took the tactic of just denying everything, didn't he? And this is farcical because you've got dozens of witnesses, and then his co-perpetrators. It's not Belzec where there's no one alive. Like the co-perpetrators are like, listen, the game's up. The best. Let's just lean on this duress argument because we can't say that it didn't happen because it obviously happened. And Franz was just saying that every single witness, and like I said, there were dozens, is just making it up out of thin air. So all of these normal people from different continents, some were from New York, some were from Tel Aviv, some were from Poland, they'd all come to this courtroom or they'd been interviewed where they were. And this insane sadism and brutality, but they were all making it up. And he was standing there in the court saying everybody's there's a conspiracy against him. And then he was saying, oh yeah, and my co-defendants are lying about me as well. I wasn't in the camp at that time. I never, I was just training the Travnikis, the Ukrainian guards. I never killed anyone. In fact, I love Jews. It basically says something similar to that. And at one point, do you remember this witness, Moses Rappaport, Michael? Because you mentioned him. What do you remember from Moses Rappaport?
The witness from New Jersey, the names sort of Samuel Washman and Rappaport, these names after a while sort of meld together, and it's been a while.
He arrived. His wife was heavily pregnant, so she couldn't walk to the assembly.
Yeah.
And then he's in court, and her and his young son are shot. So he has his family murdered
right in front of him. Yeah.
Right in front of him, and then he's telling this story in the dock, and then Franz is grinning broadly whilst he tells this story. Like, just what?
what's remarkable is how the judges respond to Franz's just unbelievably churlish, behavior, just insolent, churlish behavior. They actually admonish him over and over again. And there was one point where just the judge, this is the presiding judge, Gottlieb, I think his name was, and said basically, shut up, shut the F up. I've had enough of your mouth. According to you, you're the only innocent person in the world. Everybody is conspiring against you. And even the judges had had enough of him after a while. And of course, the judges, as you know, great tradition in Germany of preserving perfect objectivity and detachment, from the events of the trial. But to hear the judges had just gotten enough of him, it was. You can imagine what this guy would have been like 15, 20 years earlier when he was given free rein within the conditions of the camp to do as he wanted to do. But if he's this bad 20 years later as a middle-aged guy, after the fact, treating these witnesses with such heartless insolence, and you can imagine what he would have done in the camp itself. It's not for nothing that the judges really threw the book at him at the end.
Well, believe me, I read the next 20 years of his life, he never changes. I never see any inkling of contrition or remorse or even acceptance. Like, I start off with a vignette about Franz, my chapter about Holocaust denial, because he always admitted what happened at Treblinka, but he is an outright denier to a ludicrous extent of his own role there. And, I think that was, we might come on later, I think that was fundamental. It's quite depressing that he was eventually released. And I come to this conclusion about Franz, that if he'd have admitted to at least one of these murders, like saying, yeah, okay, I did butcher that child, or yeah, I did set my dog on, these prisoners and I did train it to rip their genitals off, or I did kill this, I did, murder that person on the shooting range, or I did have a gallows. Like, all of these testimonies are now flooding into my head. He once hung someone up by the feet, and it said that their head grew to improbable proportions, and Franz did this on purpose, and he got everyone out and then shot him in the head, so just to get the maximum amount of blood everywhere. He kicked a pregnant woman to death at one point. Like, it just goes on and on and on and on. And I think if he'd have admitted to one of these, he was like, yeah, I did boot that woman to death, although she was heavily pregnant, I don't think he'd have ever got out of incarceration, but he stuck to his guns for decades and decades. I think it was like 40 years. He kept on saying, I never did a thing wrong. And maybe in the authorities, that was enough to just plant a seed of doubt, at least like a couple of % of doubt. And eventually, on compassionate grounds, he ends up spending the last 10 years of his life. I think it's about 10 years of his life on compassionate grounds because his wife's ill. I've actually got the medical records of his wife. His wife sounded like she was in a bad state, but he keeps on leaning into this, and they give him day releases, and then he's asking for more than a day. So they keep giving him a taste of freedom. And it's such a weird situation. I was reading these files. He had to have a social worker of some sort accompany him while he's on day release. So it's like him, his wife, and then the social worker. Can you imagine what a weird situation that would be if you were the social worker?
Jonny, have you pondered the irony of all of this? Franz is given the benefit of a leniency and a mercy that he never, ever, ever showed anybody at Treblinka for one moment.
Oh, the irony is staggering, isn't it?
And
he would be released on compassionate grounds for him or his wife. And by the way, he was cheating on his wife while he was in Treblinka.
There you go.
He was having an affair with that nurse from the nearby hospital.
Jonny, I think it's what we're talking about, this topic. And on the one hand, we want to have a certain degree of historical, fairness and objectivity and even-handedness. But it's important, and I think we do this and have done it. through the series is to call these people out for what they've done. I mean, this is as bad a human being as any you will ever encounter. You know, whether it's Holocaust related or not, this is as bad a human being as the human race has produced, and people need to know that. And his reputation needs to be sustained as one of infamy and unending reproach and condemnation.
So just to touch on his defense at the trial, summarized by the court as the following: he was aware that the killing of innocent Jews and Gypsies was unlawful. He felt sorry for the Jews from the bottom of his heart. He is not an anti-Semite, but a benevolent friend of all Jews. Like, oh, for fuck's sake.
Johnny, did you ever see the one of the Pink Panther movies where Inspector Dreyfus is doing the funeral oration for Inspector Clouseau, and turns out that Clouseau has not died, and Clouseau's actually there at his own funeral, and so Dreyfus is reading, above all, he was a humble man, and then Dreyfus again bursts out laughing and has to hold his hand. That's how I feel listening to this, right? I mean,
yeah.
It's just so preposterous. The pose of innocence is so laughable, just in view of the scale of crimes he committed.
Yeah, I think the only, I don't know why I'm laughing, because it's just so fucking awful, but what else do you do? He says also, there's loads of this, by the way, it's all preposterous, but he says he only beat Jews twice. Each time, and this is linking back to one of our other podcasts, each time on the instruction and under supervision of, who do you think they're going to throw under the bus again? Christian Worth.
Of course. Oh, he's a universe, and deservedly so. He was terrible also, but
yeah.
But he, Heydrich, some of the others who didn't survive the war were wonderful scapegoats to try to assoil the sins of the defendants at trial. Yeah.
He only beat Jews on and otherwise tried to be very correct towards the prisoners. He did not kill any Jew with his own hands. Right. I won't read all of this, but I'll read the next one. The Jews have him to thank for the successful uprising of 2nd of August 1943. Right. He was very sympathetic to the inmates' efforts to revolt. Oh, I can't believe he stood there with a straight face and said this.
Johnny, we're having an Inspector Dreyfus moment here, How can you keep a straight face listening to such balderdash, right? It's the complete opposite of the truth.
And then I like leap forward 17 years. So he's incarcerated. Oh God, like this guy constantly thinks that he's getting a hard deal. Where he's like, I need to be in an open air prison. I was told I was going to, and to my shock and horror, I did not find myself in an open air prison. So he's just constantly, he's got a lawyer, he must have some cash. They are just pestering the authorities non-stop.
Hey, Johnny, it's too bad that that the Americans or the British didn't have a go at him in 1945 to 46. How do you think he would have fared at that time?
Oh, God, yeah.
The military commission trials that the Americans and the British held.
Yeah. Oh, no.
They hanged almost 40 people coming out of the major
Even 10% of the evidence, less than that. Even, he would be murdered. Well, not murdered, but he would be hung.
He would have been hanged from behind
100 times over. And, that would have been the best thing for this guy. He says in this, so I found one of the most amazing primary sources that I found was a letter that he penned personally to the president of the Cologne Corporation office on the 15th of February 1977. So he's been in jail now for 12 years now, but including pre-trial detention, 17.
Yeah.
So he penned this: inexplicable measures in prison. He'd given that this title. And some of the stuff he says was, on television all over the world, character assassination was being carried out against me. Jewish witnesses came to the witness stand with the picture they had cut out of newspapers in their home countries. This is how I was made a scapegoat. I am not a murderer. I am imprisoned for more than 17 years for crimes I did not commit. After the war, I returned to my hometown with a clear conscience. And it goes on and on and on and on. And he gets another interesting thing is that he has obviously paid this psychologist called Dr. Rather to come in and assess him to see if he's got any criminal tendencies. And he says that the conclusion is that I have no criminal tendencies.
No.
Like these, so this is a story beyond Franz. Like, who on earth is his lawyer? Like, and who on earth are these psychologists that are being paid to give him like these assessments?
Jonny,
this is a mass scandal.
Jonny, my friend, my dear friend, take it from a former criminal defense attorney. You can find a professional psychologist, psychiatrist, whoever it is, somewhere in the world to say anything about anything. You give them enough money, they'll tell you what you want to hear. And ultimately, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, well,
it's worthless. It's worthless pieces of paper that have no significance, because ultimately it doesn't matter what a psychiatrist says in the 1970s about Franz. It has no bearing upon what he did in the 1940s when he was at Treblinka.
Yeah.
No court in the world would accept that testimony, by the way. I mean, some indication in the 1970s, and about whether he, number one, the idea that a psychiatrist could come into a court of law and say this person is incapable of committing a crime would never be accepted by any legal system. Right? That's what the court's role is. This is to determine whether the defendant committed the crime or not. The psychiatrist doesn't come in and say that.
Well, this is 17 years later, so he's trying to collect evidence to get himself out of pre-trial detention.
He's probably trying to convince the authorities that he's not a threat any longer. But ultimately, this material is entirely irrelevant to the question of what he did.
Yeah.
And he's being punished for what he did.
I think, but he knows, and I think he and his lawyer know that actually this is going to help him get out. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing it. And they roped the social worker in as well. There's a line from this social worker's report, and I just remember just thinking, what a weird situation. So these social workers go in while Franz is caring for his wife, and the social worker's saying, oh, he was caring for his wife in a really touching way.
What a good guy.
Oh, God, it just makes you feel sick, doesn't it?
And who knows, maybe he was caring for his wife as a way to manipulate the court?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, he wasn't thinking about his wife, was he?
No.
When he was stationed at Treblinka, he was having that affair.
Only later, it's to his advantage to project an image of being the caring husband. Only then does he evince some sympathy for her. It's again, for people who maybe are not swimming in this water, or waters who have not swum in the waters of criminal law and criminal procedure, don't be played by this. Right?
No,
he's trying to play people,
and
he's the worst of the worst. So he's a liar. He's not just a liar. He's an inveterate liar and a mass murderer and a sadist and a child murderer.
Yeah,
and now he's trying to perpetrate a fraud on everybody around him to get out of jail, to elude responsibility for what he did.
I was surprised that they had like a lot of the documents there were certain documents that said, no, you can't look at that. It's, it hasn't, or like it's classified information, or like the time span hasn't run out on that yet. But they actually had his wife's medical diagnoses in there. And I'm sure that wasn't supposed to get through to me, but she was in a bad way. And I always like listen to this. Coronary heart disease with a condition after infraction and a pacemaker implantation when she was 81, cervical spine column syndrome, unstable hypertension, condition after pneumonia, when she became 84 with acute collapse symptoms, unexplained genesis, glaucoma on both sides, lipid metabolism disorder, and condition after appendectomy in 1932, dizziness, combined with motor speech disorders and a loss of feeling in the left side. It's like, whew. Like she really was on death's door. And he has thought, right, he's been coy. He's like, oh yes, she's ill. Like she's about to die. So what I'll do is I'll use that. That's my ticket to freedom. And it like annoyingly, he was right. It was his ticket to freedom.
Again, being given the benefit of a merciful attitude, and very misplaced in this case, by the way. I mean, I'm all for mercy and decency, and I mean, it goes without saying, but you also cannot allow a savage, unpenitent person like Franz to work the system and exploit its loopholes in order to avoid justice. And that's precisely what happened here.
Right, let's wrap this up or get towards wrapping it up. I've got a couple of images that I want to share, and then we'll look at the final verdicts from the Treblinka trial. And we'll, hopefully stop talking about Franz for a little while.
Well, forever.
Well, yeah, I know that I always find my way back to these people.
Me too.
Right. So we've got some of the perpetrators and some of the images here. We've got the dog Barry. I don't think we'll have a real chance to get onto him, but there was
so much we could talk about with Barry. Huh?
Yeah, I think maybe we can always do another podcast on Treblinka, just like what happened there.
Yeah.
There's some of these images, like this was the guards in their recreational time running around the perimeter. This is the lazarette. This is August Wilhelm Miete, the lazarette. You can see that there's a red cross symbol, so it's a fake hospital. And in this ditch, we've got two perpetrators, Willy Menz and August Wilhelm Miete, and they are on duty mainly here. So every transport essentially has got people that are too ill or too infirm to be brought to this place, the lazarette, and then there'll be prisoners that are sick or people that have just stepped out of line or just arbitrarily have been decided that they're going to be murdered. The person that I mentioned earlier who had tried to commit suicide, he was brought here and murdered by Miete. I found some really interesting stuff about Miete as well. The company that he worked for were trying to get him out consistently, pestering to get him out of pretrial detention, which says a lot about them as well. And you've got Miete and Menz here, and this is in like a T4 retreat as well with their wives and girlfriends during their stationing at Treblinka. And Miete and Menz, at one point of the trial, Michael, I think in your chapter, you say day 6 of the trial was quite a staggering day of the trial just because of their frankness about their crimes. They completely admitted it, didn't they?
They did, yeah. Of course, they pursue a different strategy from Franz. Franz's defense was that everything was a lie. Every accusation was a lie against him. But for Matas and Miete, they conceded their involvement in shooting Jews, mistreating Jews, but they claimed they had to do it due to duress. They raised the Befehlsnotstand, for the Notwendigkeit defense, that they had no choice. They were threatened with life and limb, danger of life and limb if they didn't do what they do. Which didn't work, as it turns out. It was rejected by the court.
I think, you need to hear this to believe it. So I'm going to read some of the testimony given by Miete. He said there were always sick and crippled people in the transports. There were also those who had been shot and wounded en route by SS policemen or Latvians who guarded the transports. These ill, crippled and wounded passengers were brought to the lazarette by a special group of workers. Inside the lazarette, they placed or lay these people at the edge of a pit. When all the sick and wounded had been brought, it was my job to shoot them. I fired at the nape of the neck with a 9mm pistol. Those shot would fall into the pit. The number of people shot in this way from each transport varied, sometimes 2 or 3, and sometimes 20 or even more. They included men, women, young and old, and also children. And there's several different harrowing accounts of him murdering kids from his own mouth and from witnesses as well. But you say that, yeah, they lean into this duress argument, which has come up again and again as we've been doing these podcasts. But him and Mentz, I thought this was interesting. They must have colluded. They both try and state their victim number at about 200, which is just implausible, because we have the records of how often they were stationed at the lazaret and how many transports were coming in. So 200, they bet on their most active days they'd kill 200 people in 2 or 3 days. The court says the number of transport Jews killed by him will likely be in the thousands, and it's thought that arbitrarily, or not arbitrarily, but outside of the gas chamber killings, Willy Mentz likely killed the most people, and he had another farcical defense as well. Again, it's just following orders, but at the court, this thing about feeling sorry from the bottom of the heart comes up again, which is just interesting phraseology that Franz and Willy Mentz would use it. He felt sorry for all the Jews from the bottom of his heart, but he didn't have much of an opportunity to show his sympathy for them since he had been ordered to kill. Some hospital victims would have faced death with composure, others would have cried and screamed. Some crying and screaming victims would have asked him to shoot them first. He then complied with these wishes out of pity. Really nice. Just what a nice guy. It's not over yet. After all, he even sometimes asked out of pity who wanted to come first. Just a stellar human being, and deserves.
Obviously, the court is not going to smile upon any of his defenses, and you wonder at the time he was uttering them whether he really thought that they would believe what he's saying. I don't know. Maybe it was just a form of self-deception. Maybe he was trying to convince himself that he really acted that way. I don't know.
Maybe, yeah. I don't know. Maybe he thought he might as well give it a try. It's not going to hurt his defense, is it? If he says this rubbish,
he may not be any worse off, and who knows?
And
but it didn't work.
Here's the man of the moment himself. It's nice, always nice to stare into his eyes, isn't it, Michael?
Yeah.
This is Kurt Franz, and pictured here, a free man, unlike his victims who were dead in a ditch or cremated somewhere. This is him living out the last years of his life in comfort, and eventually dying of natural causes, a free man. And he gives this interview as well. Have you ever seen this YouTube interview?
Yeah, I haven't seen it, so I'll probably check it out at some point if I can.
It's
prevent myself from throwing out as I want. Yeah.
It's horrible to see him in like a video, just like a moving character as well, and to hear his voice, like saying, it's quite sickening. And he's giving the reason that he's giving that interview is quite obvious. He's trying to, it's self-exculpatory. He's trying to say again, this was awful, what was happening. Very, very frank about what Treblinka was. So Holocaust deniers, how are you going to explain that? I'm sure you'll find a way. You just say, he's Holocaust survivors always find some way to discredit any piece of evidence, don't they? So I'm sure they can do it with that.
All the more reason not to listen to them.
Yeah. Okay, and then we come to the judgments. So, Kurt Franz, life imprisonment. I think it was. So he's charged as a perpetrator, and before Franz Stangel's trial, which comes in 1971, I think. So he's caught in Brazil by Simon Wiesenthal. Franz is the first commander of Operation Reinhard to stand trial before Stangl.
That's right.
And he's actually convicted as a perpetrator, and this is very rare considering, for the Operation Reinhard camp trials, this is very rare considering the amount of people that are tried. There's only maybe 4 or 5 that are convicted as perpetrators.
So what this effectively means, again, Johnny, is that the court thought that Franz not only committed these acts that the witness has testified to, but that he inwardly approved of the final solution in the mass murder, the extermination of Jews at Treblinka. Was that inward identification of the defendant with the programs of mass murder, of genocide, created by Hitler and his followers,
and that he'd gone above and beyond his orders.
Yes,
of course,
excess,
as well.
Excess, yeah. So you have not only an inward identification, but also the commission of these acts of cruelty and savagery, which were not required even to carry out the orders that were given to him.
I think an awkward piece of evidence for Kurt Franz at his trial was like a letter from Himmler saying, like, giving him promotion and saying that he'd behaved in an exemplary way whilst in the killing center.
Among the most meritorious of all Operation Reinhard operatives.
Yeah,
as it says.
We could talk all day about these perpetrators. One day I would like to talk to you about Erwin Lambert, because I think this is a fascinating thing for everyone to consider. Yes. So he was a stonemason, so he built gas chambers, and
that was his thing. Yeah, he constructed gas chambers for Operation Reinhard, and not just at Treblinka, others too.
Yeah, and T4 as well.
Yes,
so, you know, just for our listeners to think about where does he fit in this realm of perpetration and perpetrators? Should he be punished as harshly as someone like, for me? Absolutely, yes. It doesn't.
So. I think so.
If somebody's not building the gas chambers, like, you can't get a non-specialist to build a gas chamber. It's not going to work.
And Johnny, think of it. I mean, this is another really important link with T4. So what we're seeing is the cross-pollination now of killing methodologies from the murder of the mentally handicapped, which are then imported into Operation Reinhard. But the recreation of those methods of camps, also Treblinka, Sobibor.
So Willy Benz is released 1978. So Mathers actually dies in prison in 1978. That is rare. If people don't know the history of these trials, that is very rare for someone to die in prison, which is astonishing in itself. 3 months, yeah, okay, I get a release like that. You don't want to have him die in prison. Fair enough. He staggers on for 3 months and then dies. I don't have much problem with that.
Right. Yeah.
August Meite, released in 1985, dies in 1987. He should never have been released. Yes. 2 years. Apparently, lots of these perpetrators, and I can't speak to the veracity of this, I don't have proof, but apparently lots of them had stashed away and sent home lots of valuables, and he had this like really nice holiday home that he died in due to the money that he'd pillaged from the mountains of valuables that were there at his fingertips while he was stationed in Treblinka.
Johnny, yeah. After Franz, he may have been the worst in the camp, arguably.
Yeah.
After
Franz. And then, well, I think, yeah, it's difficult to compare these monsters, isn't it? Gustav Munzberger, interesting. And one thing I'd like to say about this as well is we have a cook. We have Willy Benz. I think he was a nurse. I know Matthes was a nurse. We've got a stonemason. And then we've got a carpenter, a farmer. And I don't mean like a farmer until Meite was a farmer until he joined the army, like in the 20s or the beginning of the 30s. He was a farmer until 1940. And he was a farmer in T4 as well. He was seen to livestock on the T. He was given an SS uniform when he came in and taught to shoot. He hadn't killed anyone before he arrived in Treblinka. And then in the next 18 months, he ends up killing thousands of people.
It's a really good example of how you can elicit extraordinarily destructive behavior from, to use the Browning phrase, right? Fairly ordinary men.
Yeah. Meite definitely for me.
Violence. Yeah.
he definitely fits that ordinary men thesis, because I've read his files as well, and obviously between the end of the war, 45, there's about about 10 years, or no, about 15 years before he's arrested. So he has that 15 years, and he becomes a very successful executive somewhere.
One of them was a photographer, and I can't recall which one.
That was, I think, that was one of the ones that was the older guy. So I'm pretty sure that was Albert Rum.
Might have been Rum.
Yeah, so he was just a photographer. Yeah. And yeah, I said this in my dissertation. Ironically, he asked for a transfer because he's breathing in the toxic fumes from the photography lab, and he says that it's bad for his health. I just thought there was a kind of sickening parallel to the gas chambers of Treblinka. I think that's Rum. Yeah, he was. So he died in 1970. So he was one of the older people as well, and he was a photographer in T4, but he'd been a career waiter. Someone else that maybe another time we could talk about is Sushamel.
Yes,
because he gives that testimony.
Right? And Landsmann's Show documentary.
Yeah, he's secretly filmed, isn't he, for Landsmann's Show, a documentary, and he gives some of the most lucid and horrifying testimony that I have ever heard on the Holocaust.
I'll tell you, Johnny, we may want to consider at some point doing a podcast on the gray zone.
Mm.
That would be really interesting in light of our discussions of the Operation Reinhard camps, and I think Zuckermel was an excellent example of the gray zone.
Yeah, I think there's a few. Yeah, I think Munzberger as well.
More than one, but I think he is among them. Yeah,
because Munzberger's a carpenter by trade. And then Gitta Sereni. Her book is obviously focused on Stangl and the injuries with him, but she also goes over to Munzberger's residence and speaks to his son. And I think Munzberger's there as well when they're talking. So Munzberger says he released something, so he has 6 years. Goes back to being a carpenter, like carpenter after the war, banged up for a little bit, and then carpenter again, dies in comfort. Like 12 years in prison. So how much does he serve? Less than half at a push. So they're all either being released or serving minimal parts of their detention. And even the monster of Kurt Franz, released 1993, dies 1998. Okay, it's not as bad as I thought. I thought he had longer than that, but still 5 years. And you can see in this interview that I showed you, he's not sick at all.
Presumably, he was released out of humanitarian concern for his wife, right? I mean, I think that is the reason why he was released.
And mainly just because he had a good lawyer and he was just pestering them. If he hadn't been pestering them over and over again, and like I said earlier, if he'd have admitted to some of what he did, again, probably he's not going to get out. So, unfortunately,
a really important point to underscore too, I think, is despite these releases, right, which are kind of dispiriting, the Treblinka trial was quite successful when compared with some of the others, Belzec in particular, or even Zogelboy. The rates of conviction were much higher, the punishments were much stiffer. Mm-hmm. So this was a pretty successful trial.
Yeah.
Because of the eyewitness testimony. At least that's what I try to argue in my book.
Yeah. And I think that's an interesting point, because towards lay people and people that maybe, if you've only watched this podcast and you haven't watched Belzec or Sobibor or the Frankfurt or the Ulm trials, you'd be like, what? Successful? Look at the verdicts that are being passed down.
They seem laughable, don't they? I mean, to a common person, they would. But you have to put it in the context of all of these other trials that we've been talking about, and the kind of extraordinary constraints that prosecutors were facing, where they just didn't have eyewitness testimony in many cases to make the charges stick. That was the crucial factor.
And I think we can say that they definitely got a fair trial, and we can say that because of the Belzec trial. We have 88% acquittal rate for Belzec. So it wasn't like the West German judiciary was just going after these people and whatever happened, they were just going to send them under. You can see that you get massive amounts of acquittal, and the way that they're dealing with survivor testimony, I think and this came through with the last podcast, with some of the way that they dealt with testimony, and they interrogated it for its truthfulness and its robustness. I think that the legal process was actually quite good, would you say?
I do. Yeah. I mean, I didn't expect to arrive at that conclusion when I first began my research. I was expecting to be much more critical of the quality of justice being administered, but as I delved into the cases, I really came to appreciate that they, for the most part, there were a few, and I talk about these in my book, there were a few flies in the ointment every so often that suggested that maybe there was an effort to relent and to cut these guys some slack. But for the most part, there seemed to be a conscientious effort to see that justice was done. That was my conclusion.
Yeah, and you did say that you've touched upon the fact that they were using German common law, and really, if we're to blame the sentences on anything, it wasn't really fit for purpose, was it, to use German common law for this kind of crime, like, joint complicity in the murder of 300,000 people, like 3 years, stuff like that.
I made the comment a few podcasts ago that the Germans missed the opportunity that they were given when they created the Basic Law. They could have written a provision into the Basic Law that would have effectively provided a platform for treating Nazi crimes differently. They could have done that, and they chose not to do it. And I think that was the ultimate original sin, if you think of it in that metaphor, that affected all of the subsequent trials, because the Germans were then encumbered with their own legal system and trying to use that legal system as a way to do justice for these crimes, which just don't quite fit paragraph 211, which is the homicide statute.
Well, I think that over the course of this podcast series, as we come to its final end, there's been so many big picture messages to consider. There's the nature of perpetration, perpetrator motives, and the role of law and justice and memory. I think there's so much for people, if they've been following along, to now go on and unpack. And this is basically just been an introduction to these different trials. But it's been, for me, it's been like going back to school. So thank you for these podcasts, this little series that we've done, and hopefully it's useful to other people.
That's why we did it. And it's been a great pleasure to spend some time with you. And like I said, maybe we could put together a few others in the future that might address.
I think we've got lots of ideas, haven't we?
Yeah.
We're not going to run out of ideas.
We're from it.
Well, I know that you're in Germany and you've got important things to attend, so I will just say a final thank you, Michael, and I look forward to working with you again in the future.
We'll definitely make it happen. Look forward to it.
Cheers, Michael.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.